Day 28 dawned cooler than the previous mornings, a thin mist hanging over Newtown and clinging to the edges of the forest like a reluctant guest. Wyatt noticed it immediately as the shuttle set down, the diffused sunlight turning the still damp streets a pale silver. The dinner of the previous evening had lingered in his thoughts longer than he had expected. Clara had been relaxed in a way he rarely saw on the ship. Cynthia was less sharp-edged, and General Swallowtail. Well, Wyatt suspected Clara had learned exactly what she'd wanted to know. If the general had noticed he was being evaluated, he'd given no sign of it. Wyatt barely had time to finish his first cup of tea before the day began asserting itself. Rachel intercepted him outside the inn, her data pad already lit. The toy distribution had triggered something neither of them had quite anticipated. Requests were coming in from nearby settlements. Wyatt sighed softly. "We'll help where we can," he said. "But we don't have the manpower to run other people's operations." Rachel nodded, relieved. Wyatt smiled faintly. "Looks like you're writing a handbook." At the school hall, the aftermath of the toy distribution was still visible. Children clutched favorite items as they lined up for class, several clearly exhausted from a sleepless night of excitement. Elizabeth stood at the door, greeting them all by name. There was a calm authority in the way she managed them now, a confidence that hadn't been there when he'd first arrived. When she spotted him, she smiled and waved him over. "We're starting a mixed art and observation lesson this morning," she said. Wyatt glanced at the camera case resting carefully on her desk. "I see you didn't waste any time."
Elizabeth laughed. "I haven't even turned it on yet. I'm saving that for after lunch, assuming I survive the questions." Out by the sawmill site, Anno was overseeing the delivery of the last structural components. The roof supports were finally going up, and the change was dramatic. What had once been an exposed slab was now unmistakably becoming a permanent facility. Anno handed Wyatt a hard hat without comment, and Wyatt accepted it without protest. They walked the perimeter together, while Anno explained the revised workflow. Logs would come in from the forest side, be processed and graded, then either sent to storage or directly to fabrication depending on need. Wyatt nodded, mentally overlaying transport routes and manpower. "Once this is operational," he said, "we reduce reliance on off-world shipments by a noticeable margin." Anno grinned. "That's the idea. Also, the foresters have stopped calling it your mad project and started calling it our mill." Later in the day, Wyatt met briefly with Marcus and the fabrication team. The orange forestry vehicle had become something of a local attraction. One of the mechanics was already sketching a civilian variant, slightly smaller, less armored, intended for agricultural and maintenance use. Wyatt approved the concept with minimal hesitation. "Prototype first," he said. "No promises, no announcements." Marcus nodded. "Understood. Though the news crew keeps asking if they can film the next test run." Wyatt sighed. "Let them, after we finished stress testing. I don't want publicity built on optimism." By mid-afternoon, Wyatt finally found himself alone, walking the edge of the forest. The trees here were younger, regrowth after devastation, but stubborn and determined. He paused beside one of the markers designating a future planting site, and made a note to ask Elizabeth if any of the native flowering plants would thrive here. The Barony was growing, not just in infrastructure, but in identity. People weren't merely surviving anymore. They were planning. As evening approached, Wyatt returned to the square just as the lights flickered on. The stained glass panel in Elizabeth's storefront caught the glow and scattered it across the street in soft colors. Someone had placed a small bench opposite it, and two children sat there quietly, watching the light move. Wyatt stopped just for a moment and allowed himself a rare sense of satisfaction. Day 28 hadn't been dramatic. No battles fought, no speeches given, but foundations had been strengthened, trust reinforced, and a future made a little more solid. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring fresh problems. It always did. But for now, the barony of screaming forests slept peacefully, and Wyatt allowed himself the small luxury of believing that was no accident.
As night settled fully over Newtown, Wyatt found himself once again seated at the small desk in the town hall annex, reviewing reports by the soft glow of a single lamp. Outside, the settlement had taken on a quieter rhythm. Lights dimmed automatically in unused buildings. Footsteps became infrequent. and the distant sound of the sea blended with the low hum of generators. It was in these moments, after the bustle had faded, that Wyatt felt the true weight of responsibility. Not the dramatic kind that came with combat or command decisions, but the slow, persistent pressure of ensuring that tomorrow would be better than today. The first report he reviewed concerned housing. Temporary accommodations were finally being vacated as repairs to permanent dwellings reached completion. Marcus had included annotated images showing before and after comparisons, and Wyatt paused longer than necessary on one particular set. A building that had once been scorched and half-collapsed now stood whole again, freshly painted, its windows reflecting the lights of the square. It struck Wyatt that this wasn't merely reconstruction, it was reclamation. These people were no longer refugees clinging to survival. They were residents again. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Anno stepped inside without waiting for an answer, carrying 2 mugs. He set one down in front of Wyatt. "You missed dinner," he said simply. Wyatt accepted the mug with a grateful nod. "I know. It got away from me." Anno leaned against the wall, arms folded. "It usually does." There was a brief, companionable silence before Anno continued. The foresters finished their perimeter survey. No unusual movement. No signs of Drazen activity. Just animals and weather. It was from the Noir Navio, routed through Clara's office. The fleet would be departing the hash trunk system at first light. Final supply transfers were underway, and Wyatt was expected to return aboard within the next 12 hours. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Leaving always felt wrong, even when he knew it was temporary. But systems like this didn't run on instinct alone. He composed a brief reply, then forwarded a secondary message to his team, scheduling an early morning handover meeting. As soon as he sent it, a sense of inevitability settled over him. Day 28 was becoming a threshold, whether he liked it or not. Wyatt rose and stepped outside. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of salt and vegetation. Across the square, Elizabeth's shop was dark, but a dim light glowed in the apartment above. He smiled faintly, imagining her still awake, likely sketching or organizing notes. Further along, the inn's windows glowed warmly, laughter spilling out into the night. Life, ordinary and resilient, continued. He walked slowly toward the shoreline path, boots crunching softly against gravel. The sea was calm, reflecting the stars with near-perfect clarity. Wyatt stopped at a familiar outcrop and sat, letting the silence wrap around him. Industry was returning. Education was stabilizing. Culture, art, music, craftsmanship was beginning to surface again. These weren't side effects of survival. They were signs of healing. Back in New Town, dawn arrived quietly. The mist returned, and the settlement stirred awake with practiced efficiency. Wyatt convened a handover meeting, going through responsibilities one by one. Rachel would oversee finances. Marcus would manage logistics. Anna would coordinate security. They asked questions and made notes. Wyatt felt an unfamiliar sense of relief as he realized he was no longer the sole axis around which everything turned. Elizabeth found him as he was leaving. She handed him a sketch from yesterday. It depicted the square at dusk, lights just coming on, capturing the feeling perfectly. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll keep it." The shuttle lifted off shortly thereafter, carrying Wyatt back toward the Noir Navio. As New Town shrank beneath him, he didn't feel the familiar anxiety of departure. Instead, there was a steadiness, a sense that things would continue even in his absence. That, he realized, was the true measure of progress. Aboard the Noir Navio, preparations for departure were underway. Clara met him, reading his expression instantly. "It went well, didn't it?" she asked. Wyatt nodded. "Better than well. It's starting to stand on its own." Clara smiled. "Good. That means we did something right." As the fleet powered up to fade into jump space, Wyatt took one last look at Ho rotating below. Day 28 had not been marked by triumph or tragedy, but it had done something far more important. It had proven that the future was no longer theoretical.